Thank you very much. So I'm very happy to be here. This is my first time in Korea, so thank you for having me. So I'm Grace, and I'm going to talk about some work that I did at the beginning of my PhD on earthquakes on the once-punctured torus. So what is the aim of the work in this talk? We're going to derive some explicit formula for earthquakes on this example for the once-punctured torus. And we're going to study earthquakes which act on Teichmüller space via Dane twists. And I'll explain some of these terms if you're not familiar with them in two ways. So the first one we'll discuss is hyperbolic geometry, and the second is using representation theory. And we're going to rely on some previously known results for the punctured torus there. And this is going to give us insight into the once-punctured torus, the kind of structures that we get on it, and their symmetry. So why do we care about this? Earthquakes were first introduced in this kind of generality that we'll use by Thurston when he was studying hyperbolic structures and Teichmüller space. And most importantly, maybe, he proved this earthquake theorem, which says that if you have any two hyperbolic structures of a surface, they are connected by a unique earthquake. So it's a very useful tool for understanding these kinds of structures. And why do we care about the once-punctured torus? This is kind of a very fundamental example of a hyperbolic surface. So it's simple enough that we can do some direct calculations and look at pictures, but it's kind of rich enough that we get some interesting results where we can hopefully get some insight. Okay, so we'll start with kind of reviewing these concepts and then go into the two approaches. Great. Okay, what is an earthquake? This is just a very intuitive explanation for them. So if we have any simple closed curve, gamma, an earthquake about them is going to twist along gamma by some prescribed amount r, some real number. So on the once-punctured torus, we have this picture on the left-hand side where we have the meridian alpha in red, the longitude beta. So this gives a framing for the fundamental group. And we also have alpha beta, just for fun. If we're earthquaking about some amount r, and this is earthquaking about alpha, we're just shifting along alpha by some amount. Okay, so alpha stays the same and the blue and green curves vary. Okay, so this is very similar to this idea of a Dane twist, which was known and studied much earlier. So if we have any simple closed curve gamma on our surface, so say we take alpha again, a Dane twist is just twisting around the whole curve and then re-gluing. So here we have these changes in the blue and green curves where we've gone all the way around alpha and then rejoined. Here we had some kind of discontinuity where we had to glue back together again. But you can kind of think of earthquakes as an extension of Dane twist, where we can now twist or shear about any amount rather than the full curve itself. Okay, but maybe I've misled you a little bit, because earthquakes are actually defined over a broader set of objects called measured geodesic laminations. So before we just had a simple closed curve, here we have a lamination L and some kind of transverse measure mu. So what is L? This is a foliation of a closed subset of our surface by some complete simple geodesics. And then mu is some transverse measure. Okay, maybe let's explain or understand this by these kind of examples I started with. So if we have any simple closed curve gamma, and if we have mu to be the counting measure, so we're just looking at the intersection number with this curve gamma, then we can think of this space of measured geodesic laminations defined by the lamination, the simple closed curve, and the measure, any real number t times the counting measure. Okay, and so our example beforehand, we just had gamma to be alpha, and we just took the counting measure itself. And in fact, this set of like simple closed curves with r times the counting measure, or t times it, is going to be dense in the overall set of measured geodesic laminations. And it's proved that, it's been proved by Kirchhoff that when we think about earthquakes here, it makes sense to think about them just on these simple closed curves. And then because of this density result, we can extend them to any measured geodesic lamination. So we can kind of keep the picture that we had before in mind, just thinking about these simple closed curves. Okay. So this was in kind of generality for any surface. Well, we're looking at the punctured torus. Yep. And so here it's even simpler, maybe when we're looking at these types of curves that we're looking at. So if we have any gamma, and we think about the framing given by alpha and beta, our meridian and longitude, then the slope of a curve gamma is just defined by the intersection number with alpha over the intersection number with beta. Okay, so this will give us any rational number here for gamma, some simple closed curve. So alpha is just going to be 0 over 1, beta is going to be 1 over 0, and alpha beta is 1 over 1. And when we think about this density result, so all of the simple closed curves are going to give you a rational slope. Any of the other measured geodesic laminations are going to give you an irrational slope. So we can think of the density in that way. Okay, great. So I kind of introduced earthquakes as deformations of our surface, so we can see how it's shifting the surface itself. It's a map from S to S where it does this. But we can also think of this as acting on the hyperbolic structure embedded on the surface. So you can think of this picture on the left-hand side as having some hyperbolic structure on the once-punctured torus. And then this kind of shifting around alpha, the red curve, is going to change the hyperbolic structure. So you can think of this as a map from Teichmüller space to itself. Or you can also think of this as prescribing a path in Teichmüller space as our parameter R varies. And I'm going to be using this third perspective, but we'll see how that fits in. Okay. And please feel free to ask questions along the way. Okay. So let's review Teichmüller space. So this is the space of all hyperbolic structures up to homotopy. So here we have a hyperbolic structure given by X, some surface with a hyperbolic metric on it. And we're only going to be looking at complete finite area hyperbolic metrics. And we have some diffeomorphism rho tilde that goes from our surface S to X. Okay, so this is going to induce a map between the fundamental group of S to the fundamental group of X. And we get this representation rho from the fundamental group to all of these orientation preserving isometries of S. And this is starting to introduce these two perspectives of the hyperbolic geometry and the kind of representation theory that I mentioned at the beginning. So for the punctured torus, it's known that the Teichmüller space of the once-punctured torus is just the hyperbolic plane. And we really think about this in terms of the upper half plane model. And the isometry preserving, the orientation preserving isometry group here is just PSL2R. So when we think about a hyperbolic structure, we can think about it on the punctured torus, we can think about it inducing a representation into PSL2R. And we can also think about this lifting into SL2R, so we just ignore the P. And so this is the kind of nice, well-known result that's not too difficult to derive yourself. So for any hyperbolic structure with some representation rho, and here we're really thinking of the representation lifted to SL2R, so the trace is well defined. Then we can compare the hyperbolic length of our simple closed curve. And here we're really thinking about the geodesic associated with that class of simple closed curves. And we can compare this to the trace of the representation applied to that curve. So there's this nice relation here. And this goes into the two coordinate systems that we use to kind of study these objects. So the first one on the left-hand side was introduced by Darrell and Catherine Pfaff, and this is a paper that's on the archive at the moment. And here we have triangle length coordinates. So we're really looking at this framing of alpha, beta, and we're taking the hyperbolic length and dividing it by 2. So these give us coordinates for our Teichmüller space. And here we have 3 coordinates, and so we have some kind of surface that's embedded in R3 that represents Teichmüller space here. Okay, and on the right-hand side, this was known a long time ago by work of Frick and Klein. We have these trace coordinates. So if we again look at our framing, we have the trace of our representation rho applied to alpha, beta, and alpha, beta. We get these trace coordinates x, y, and z. Again, we have 3 coordinates, but we have some embedding of Teichmüller space in R3. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the geometric picture first, and then we'll start to look at the algebraic picture. and we'll compare the results that we get. Okay, so let's look at the action on Teichmüller space. So we're using these triangle length coordinates. Okay, so these coordinates give us information about the lengths of the geodesics associated with these three curves, alpha, beta, and alpha, beta. So what they're really doing is they're giving us information about maximal collar neighbourhoods of our punctured torus. So what is a maximal collar neighbourhood? We're taking the neighbourhood of alpha, as in this picture. We're just taking some collar neighbourhoods, so we're expanding out from that, and it's maximal because we're expanding out until it bumps on the other side. So that's where the bumping is here. So if we just expand this collar, we just get something like this. So these are all geodesics on the inside, and then we have a curve on the boundary of the neighborhood, delta, which may not be a geodesic. And epsilon here is the half length of this neighborhood. Okay, and so here our Teichmüller space is defined by this collar equation, which A, B, and C satisfy, and that just is required to make sure that this maximal collar neighborhood is well defined and makes sense. Okay. So we have some nice results by Buser here from the 70s. So he proves some of these results in more generality, but you get inequalities. But for the punctured torus, it actually achieves the maximum or the minimum. So you get this equality. So we have the length of our edge of our neighborhood, delta, in terms of A. And we have the half length of the neighborhood also in terms of A. Okay, so that means that we can really explicitly understand what this neighborhood is and the geometry there. So let's think about how we can do a Dane twist in this maximal collar neighborhood. Okay, and let's look at the image in the upper half plane. So if we kind of unfold half of this into the upper half plane, we're going to get something like this, where these are the half lengths of our curves, the triangle length coordinates. And if we think about doing a Dane twist or an earthquake, really, what's happening is that we're twisting on the interior of this neighborhood. So the intersections with alpha are going to stay the same, but they're going to intersect delta in some other point. And so we get a picture like this, where we get a series of hyperbolic right-angled triangles. And we can solve for these to understand what happens to these lengths, B and C, when we twist by some amount, R. Okay, so this leads to the first result. So maybe this is a bit intimidating when you first see it, but so let's explain it. So for any fixed starting point that's in our representation of Teichmüller space in these coordinates, the earthquake about alpha is given by this function here. So we're starting at W, we have some parameter R, which measures how much we're twisting by, and we have these three expressions. So we're twisting about alpha, so the triangle length associated with alpha A is going to stay the same. And then the other two change by this function B sub alpha. And what this is a fun expression in terms of hyperbolic trigonometry. And this is all in the starting point. And then we only really have this earthquake parameter R coming in with a hyperbolic cosine here and a hyperbolic sine here. Okay, and this is really just doing what I said before, where we're solving explicitly for these right-angled hyperbolic triangles. Okay, good. So what we have here is, this actually isn't the standard parameterization of earthquakes. So what I've done with R here is that this represents the percentage, I guess, or the fraction of a Dane twist that we're doing. So when R is 1, we've done 1 Dane twist about alpha. When R is 2, we've done 2 Dane twists about alpha. But you can reparameterize this very easily to be in terms of hyperbolic length. And so you'll get something like this. So you have an alpha 0 appearing in the function here, but then it's disappeared in this expression down here. Okay, don't worry too much about this. And maybe it's nicer to see a picture. So this gives results for alpha. And because of the symmetry in these coordinates, we're going to be able to get similar results for beta and alpha beta, the ones given in our framing. So here, this orange hypersurface, I guess, is our representation of Teichmüller space in these coordinates. And here we've just chosen some arbitrary starting points, and we've looked, so this red curves are the earthquake about alpha. So say starting here, if you go forwards, you'll go around there. If you go backwards, you'll go around there. We start at another point, forwards go around there, backwards go around there. And you get similar things for beta in blue and for alpha beta in green. Okay, so it's nice. So we can explicitly kind of look at these things and study them. Okay. Let's flip now and talk about the other coordinate system. So independently, we had this idea of trace coordinates that were introduced by Frick and Klein, and they were introduced more generally with this idea that they parameterize the SL2C character variety of the punctured torus. So really, they were studying the free group on two elements, but the fundamental group of the punctured torus is the free group on two elements. Okay, so we don't need to worry too much about this if you don't know about character varieties, but this was actually how I kind of started this project, studying this character variety. So we get an isomorphism between the SL2C character variety of the punctured torus and C3, and that's really using these trace coordinates. Okay, so how do we see Teichmüller space here in this coordinate system? So we can define this polynomial in our coordinates kappa to be the trace of rho of our commutator, alpha inverse, beta inverse. And this is just the loop that goes around the puncture. So when we're talking about changing the geometric structure or what's happening in a broad sense on the punctured torus, this is really going to be changing the trace of the representation of the commutator. Okay, so this with basic trace identities in SL2, you can compute it's equal to this. Okay, and if you understand or if you study the relationship between these representations and the action of matrices as isometries on the hyperbolic plane, you actually can see that complete finite hyperbolic structures on the punctured torus are going to correspond to when this polynomial is equal to -2. Okay, so this is where we're going to get our Teichmüller space coming in. So we get this polynomial here, and if we plot the level set, that's just going to be 4 components that are all symmetric, that can be identified with each other. And we can choose one of these, say, in the positive octant to be our representation of Teichmüller space. And this is really the Hitchin component in this character variety. But this is really looking at SL2R now, restricting to R representations, not C. Okay, great. So how can we understand how the earthquakes work here? Well, we have some nice results on the Dane twists. So by some work of Horowitz, we know that the action of Dane twists here is equivalent to an action of the kind of specific induced polynomial automorphisms that are going to preserve the level set of this polynomial. And actually, I've written only the polynomial associated with Teichmüller space here, but in more generality on the character variety, it's going to correspond to polynomial automorphisms that preserve the level set that they started on. Okay, so if we have this picture of the Dane twist that we started with, this is the twist about alpha. What is the polynomial automorphism associated with that? Well, we have the twist about alpha, takes alpha to alpha, and it takes beta to beta alpha inverse. This is up to some choice of orientation. Okay, this is going to induce a polynomial automorphism on these trace coordinates. So x is the trace of rho applied to alpha. This stays the same. Y is the trace of rho applied to beta, which goes to the trace of rho applied to beta alpha inverse. And applying polynomial automorphism, applying trace identities, we get x, y minus z, and then we can do something similar for the last coordinate. Okay, so this is the polynomial automorphism we get when we're trying to understand the Dane twist. Okay, and we can get some similar results to what we had before in terms of understanding the earthquake. So for a fixed starting point in our representation of Teichmüller space in these coordinates, earthquake about alpha is given by this expression here. So again, the coordinate associated with alpha stays the same, and then we have some function for the other two. And here, instead of hyperbolic cosine, we have these kind of polynomial and square root expressions, and we have some expression to the power r. Okay, So how did I get this? I said we started with the Dane twist. What we were really doing is starting with repeated Dane twists. So looking at applying n number of Dane twists. And for every start point, this is going to give us a discrete orbit of points. But this is actually going to satisfy a linear recurrence relation that we can solve by kind of elementary means. And so this is going to give a continuous orbit that aligns with these Dane twists. And you can actually do this outside of Teichmüller space and the whole character variety. There are other level sets where you can extend this action. But the question is, why is this the earthquake as opposed to any other kind of flow that might extend the Dane twist? But we can actually apply the chain of coordinates that we had between the trace and triangle length coordinates to prove that they're the same. So we've kind of started with these two different perspectives of geometry and of algebra, and we've applied different methods to get the same result for the earthquake. So it gives us two different interpretations. And so again, this gives results about alpha, and we get similar symmetric results for the earthquakes about beta and alpha beta. So here's the picture of Teichmüller space in these trace coordinates with one of these components of the character variety. And we get similar orbits for the earthquakes forwards and backwards starting at different points. So the ones in red are the earthquakes about alpha. You get the earthquakes about beta in blue and alpha beta in green. So you can see the similarities with the previous picture that I showed you. Okay, so I said all earthquakes, but all I've done so far is show them for these three specific curves that we used in our coordinate systems or in our framings. So what about any general simple closed curve? Okay, so the coordinate systems that we used were very kind of highly dependent on the framing that we chose. So it's very nice for that choice of framing, but not necessarily for any other curve. But we can describe an algorithm so we can get results for any simple closed curve. So pick any gamma. The first step is to find some delta such that gamma and delta generate the fundamental group. Then we can apply the results to this specific framing of gamma and delta, and then we can convert the framing back to alpha beta. And we can always do this because of results about the mapping class group of the punctured torus. So once we choose a gamma, we can always find such a delta, and we can always map them back and forth between alpha and beta. Okay. And then when I started this talk, I said that, well, simple closed curves are dense in the measured geodesic laminations, so we can always extend the earthquake in this way. Oh, first, maybe I'll just have some more pictures. So the top two are in the triangle length coordinates, and the bottom two are in the trace coordinates. And we have the same curves we had before in red, blue, and green, and a bunch of other curves pictured where we've calculated the earthquakes using this algorithm and then mapped them back. And so you can see they're all actually quite similar in terms of how they move around, but I guess the ones outside of the framing don't quite have the same symmetry. Okay, what about measured geodesic laminations? So for any measured geodesic lamination, what we need to do is find a sequence of simple closed curves and measures that converges to this lamination, and we know that this exists because it's dense. We can then apply the results to this sequence and then try to take the limit as n goes to infinity to get the earthquake about the lamination. So this is well defined by Kirchhoff, but when you're dealing with these kind of expressions that we had, it actually gets quite complicated very quickly. So it's maybe not so practical. So I'll just explain another coordinate system that we use to look at these results where we can get some more insight. And that is the Fenchel-Nielsen length twist coordinates. So this is a very natural coordinate system to think about Teichmüller space. So these coordinates are defined by a Pant's decomposition of our surface. And so for the punctured torus, we just have one pair of Pants, and we can think about this as splitting along alpha. Okay, and then the Fenchel-Nielsen length twist coordinates are defined by the lengths of the curves in the pants decomposition and by the twists of how we glue the pants together again. So for the once-punctured torus, we just have two coordinates. We have the length of alpha and the twist associated with when we glue back along alpha again. So we can convert the earthquake expressions that we had into these Fenchel-Nielsen coordinates, and we'll get something like this. So now we have something which is on the plane, which is nice. And when we're earthquaking about alpha, it's very simple because the length of alpha doesn't change, only the twist coordinate changes. So that's what's happening when we go up and down. But it's more complex if we look at the other curves like beta or alpha beta. Okay. So we get actually some nice results here that let us understand what happens at the limit of these earthquakes. So if we have any measured geodesic lamination, we can denote the associated earthquake in Fenchel-Nielsen coordinates in terms of what happens to the length coordinate and what happens to the twist coordinate. And we can actually see that the slope of the earthquake relates at infinity relates to the slope of the initial lamination. So what does this mean? Let's look at this picture. On the left-hand side, we just have some laminations pictured in R2. So this is alpha beta in green and beta in blue. Okay. And then when we're applying the earthquake map to them in Fenchel-Nielsen coordinates, what happens is alpha, which is along the x coordinate line, gets taken to this earthquake that converges, the earthquake that goes down here, that has slope infinity. Beta goes from this y-axis line to this earthquake that has slope that tends to 0. And all of the others similarly get mapped to earthquakes that have this little twist, and then they converge to some almost linear behavior of slope that's inverse of whatever the lamination slope we started with. And the inverse is just because, I guess, my choice of framing and intersection or slope. Okay, so I said maybe understanding some of these measured geodesic laminations, writing explicit earthquakes for them is difficult, but we can characterize their limiting behavior by this result. Okay, so why is this true? Okay, so the idea is that we can prove this result directly for alpha and beta, which are our framing coordinates, framing curves. We can then prove that, so there's some results by Okai, which were then extended later, about how you can convert the Fenchel-Nielsen length twist coordinates between different pants decompositions. So if we look at the pants decomposition associated with beta, the ratio between the length function and that with the length function with the pants decomposition associated with alpha, this just converges to the intersection number between them as we go to infinity. And this length function associated with the pants decomposition for beta is going to behave like the twist function associated with alpha. So combining those, we get this result between these two. Okay, good. So we want to kind of apply this to look at some measured geodesic laminations and look at some sequences. So I just have two families of laminations where we'll look at the earthquakes. So if we consider the earthquakes in this family of laminations, so we have alpha, beta, alpha to the n-1, and we have some transverse measure mu. And what we've done is we've inserted some normalizing factor n so that this actually converges to a lamination on the other side. That makes sense? Okay, so what is happening here, this is just going to converge to something of slope 0. And so this is going to converge actually to the lamination just defined by the simple closed curve alpha again. Okay, good. So we can look at some pictures of the earthquakes and we can explicitly prove that the earthquake of this sequence converges to the earthquake about alpha. But maybe if we just look at the pictures, so again, we have the triangle length coordinates on the left and the trace coordinates on the right. So we're starting when n is equal to 1. We're starting at the green curves. And then as n increases, we're going to the yellow curve, then the orange, if you can see them properly, then the pink, and then we're going to converge to the red curves. And so you can already start to see maybe how this convergence happens. So here is the fourth step. But actually kind of calculating this and proving it explicitly involves a lot of Taylor series expansions and things like that. It's not trivial, which is funny because this is kind of the simplest example that we could think of a sequence converging to a nice lamination. Okay, so let's look at something more complex. So if we think about this mapping class group element on the punctured torus where alpha and beta are mapped as so. This is associated with the matrix N1112, and this is a pseudo-Anosov matrix. So it has two distinct eigenvalues, which are given by this. So we can also consider the family of laminations defined by applying T repeatedly to alpha. And then again, we have the counting measure mu that we're normalizing by this larger eigenvalue. What happens is this is going to converge to a measured geodesic lamination that has slope given by lambda plus the larger eigenvalue. And really, it doesn't matter what starting simple closed curve you choose, it's always going to converge to that lamination. And so this one, we couldn't actually explicitly get some form of the earthquake on the limit, but we can say something about it using these results. So we have these pictures in the bottom. Again, we start at n is equal to 1, then we have alpha beta, so these green curves, and then n is equal to 2, we go to this teal one, n is equal to 3, we go to the blue, and as n is equal to 4, we go to the light blue. And you can already see in this kind of scale of picture that they're getting very close. It's kind of hard to discern between n is equal to 3 and n is equal to 4. So it's something in there. But we can use these Fenchel-Nielsen coordinates and the result that we had there to get some numerical approximation of where the earthquake is. And so that's given in the dashed line here. So here I've split up the kind of the forwards and the backwards earthquakes. But here we're starting at some point. We have the same curves that we pictured previously starting in the earthquake about that's given in green, about alpha beta. And then we're going to teal and then we're closing in. But like I said before, we can kind of start with any simple closed curve and we're going to get the same lamination. So we can also start on the other side and start with beta and then see what happens under this sequence and the earthquakes. And so we must have that the earthquake converges to this dotted line in here. So that's the earthquake about this lamination. And then here are just some extra examples of the pictures. So I kind of tried to plot these in a lot of different coordinate systems to get a lot of different, or to try and get as much insight as possible into their behavior. So here we have the triangle length coordinates. We also have the trace coordinates, the Fenchel-Nielsen coordinates, and then coordinates on the simplex, which is kind of projecting what's happening here down onto the plane. And I think I'm pretty early, but I think that's it for me today. So thank you.